everyone, and welcome to the Life Burst podcast. Today we're going to update the Hirana No Limit Mono Red deck. We're going to talk about some different deck choices, some different options that you can use that you're not just seeing just here. So you might want to wait to the end to get all of the options in, and we're going to talk about the No Limit deck as a whole. We're also going to be basically updating it for changing Diva. That's set 02 of Wixoss. Okay, so without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. So you're going to see that actually what's on screen right now is actually got no 002 cards in it. And the answer that it doesn't have any changing Diva cards in it is because the Wixoss EU page hasn't been updated yet, but I did promise to start getting out upgraded deck techs, some updated deck techs, and new deck techs out sooner rather than later. So I'm not going to super wait for it to come out with a new version, but we'll go into it. There's actually very little that is getting upgraded to be in the 02 meta. Realistically, changing Diva, if you invested in No Limit, specifically Hirana, there's very little you need to update into changing Diva, so it's a pretty safe investment in terms of that. Most of the stuff stays relatively the same because it was a very complete deck in 01, and there's not a ton you need to do to make it more complete in 02, but you might want to stick around to the very end because I'm going to give you guys new options that you might want to throw in the deck, things that I might be underrating right now and might actually be pretty good in the future. But without any further ado, let's just get into it, right? So No Limit is the premier aggro deck of the format. If you want to go aggressive, you pretty much can't do anything better than this. It's still mono red, which is kind of cool that it stays in 2-1 colors, so you have consistent enter. But it also is, generally speaking, going to be less and less monocolored as the future goes on with it. And we're starting to maybe see a little bit of options here, going into blue, going into white, but not enough to really push us out of that mono red mentality yet. The reason why we're still running mono red is stuff like Rose Quartz and things like Hera is still going to push us in a mono red direction, as well as Nobunatsu being very red enter hungry. So we're still kind of in a red direction because of that. Now, I will say when you're looking right off the top of the bat, you're going to see a Mars here on the screen as a one-of. That's actually going to change out into a single copy of Phoenix Natural Planet Queen. You could run Mars. It's really only a one-of, so it's not that big of a deal. But that's probably the only 02 change I would make here that you can't really see on screen. But we'll go through it. This has changed a lot since the first iteration that I've shown on my channel. So we'll start with the top part. Go to the top. Go to the top is a very good, oh, there we go. We'll get there. All right, go to the top. Is our piece that is actually very, very good, but it's less good than what it was in 01 because of Xenocluster being as the piece of choice that a lot of decks are going to be running. Enter Burn is not quite as good because of that. However, you have options to still run Go to the Top in this deck, and it will still be pretty good. Inevitably, a lot of the times they will Xenocluster your Ray Lunar Blossom or your Ray Empty Blade, discard 2. So then that still makes Go to the Top a pretty safe option for aggro decks. Go to the Top as a piece becomes less good in mid-range decks and forward, but I still think it's very good in aggro decks. Its purpose is to basically say you're going to get to the end thing, you just need to get a couple more pieces of life burst damage. They've got 1 or 2, maybe 3 enter in their field. You use Go to the Top to basically remove the chance that they can assist Elrig grow to save some life cloth damage, and then you're an aggro deck, so that was the last couple life cloth damage you needed to do to win, and now you win the game. So that's why you're running Go to the Top. Of course you're going to run Glory Grow. That's the whole reason that you want to run this specific No Limit deck, because when you Glory Grow with No Limit, they can't guard, you're going to get at least probably 2 life burst damage in that turn, which is 2 can be the difference between winning or losing, as well as just getting in that last bits of damage on turn 3. You're pretty much always going to want to my guess would be play turn. Play No Limit turn as is the second deck to play. Not necessarily because you don't want to rush to get to this turn 3, but because then you should be able to go to the top to burn their last enter and win the game with them. The Akino assists are pretty normal. You're going to be running, let's see if we get there, Akino Rock and Akino Bye Bye. Now, Akino Rock is a solid level 1 that just bounces pretty much anything to their hand early game. It's going to get you in there for at least 1 life cloth damage pretty early on. So Akino Rock is a number 1 inclusion for your Akino choices. I would not go with any other Akino. I probably wouldn't go with any other Akino other than Akino Bye Bye as well. You're very rarely going to use the second ability, which is the enter, pay 2, get a target guard from your trash to your hand, but it will help you win in a race against other No Limit, other aggro decks, so it's worth having that option. You're mainly going to be using it as an attack phase, return target Signia on your opponent's field to their hand. So you're depriving them of a little bit of enter, and you're getting in for a lane damage. Talking about Ray here, we have Ray Luna Blossom, a level 1 that lets you draw a card, and then the opponent has to discard a card at random, as well as Ray Empty Blade, a level 2, only costs 1, which is really cheap to draw 2, and then make the opponent discard 2 at random. This is just really good at getting rid of guards out of their hands, and messing up with a little bit of their late game to basically soften them up for you to finish them off with. Plus getting gas for you to attack with. And then of course you're running the Hiranas like normal, right? Just to go into exactly what you know, Hirana is a top-notch L-Rig. It's going to be buffing your attacking Signy, which is seemingly innocuous until you realize that it basically lets you get over every single wall that your opponents are going to play against you. It's going to crush their walls, which is, good for you because you keep putting that pressure on them over and over and over again. It basically has a discounted enter cost, being that it enter charges when it enters, so it really only costs a single enter. And then the once a game ability is just the cherry on the cake. The reason why you're running this over something like Akino as a center, because it is 1 life burst damage, life crush damage every time with no fuss whatsoever. The only thing that it requires is that you're able to down 2 level 2 L-Rigs, which by turn 4, to ensure yourself getting the victory, you probably have done. Plus, you'll notice that every single one of these L-Rigs are very cheap to grow, and that's one of your main reasons why. Getting straight into the main deck here, you'll see that there's 2 Percival, and I really feel uncomfortable with the number of 2 Percivals. If you can figure out a way to get yourself up to 4, it becomes much more comfortable. The only thing you're paying for with that Percival is Akino Bye Bye. Because it's so limited how often you're going to be paying for it, you can get away with running 2 and plus your 4 servants as enter to sometimes pay for that white cost. I would just be aware that if you are going to enter this, that you'll want to reserve this until late game if possible, to not use it until you have Akino ready to go, and then you can use it with that. Its job is just to be a pretty big, decent damage dealer. It can hit most level 1s and some level 2s for lethal, as well as being multicolored. Sita, on the other hand, is a vanilla card. It doesn't do much, it's just a level 1, but that life burst, vanish target Signy on your opponent's field 8,000 or less, and it costs no enter to do so, is great. And that's the reason you run it, is because everything in this deck wants to say vanish, burst, break life cloth. You're the aggro deck. Everything should be geared towards that, with the exception of a little bit of your L-Rig deck that you're trying to basically play a little bit of tempo with your L-Rig deck, but your main deck should all be pretty redundant of saying just damage the opponent as much as possible. Your other level 1s, of course, is Servant. You might be interested in getting rid of Servants for more aggression. It's probably a bad move. This inevitably will allow you to win a foot race against another aggro deck just by the process of stopping 1 life burst damage, aka now you're winning the race. And then you've got Rommel, lightly armed. This is pretty much the only deck in the format that can successfully run Rommel, and it's good in this deck, by the way. You might be interested in cutting it for something like Hanel to get yourself some more diversity, but I wouldn't. I think that this ability to destroy something power 3000 or less gets better as the format goes on, because things start to end up being cheaper and cheaper in order for a downside, quote unquote, to having a better and better text box. And as such, Romel just gets better and better as the meta goes forward. It's weakest up against, by the way, to these like multicolored cards, but people cut the multicolored cards for the cards that inevitably have better text on them. So you'll see that Romel becomes better as time goes on. And that's all your level 1s. Moving on into, well, you've actually got one more level 1 here. Eris, Crimson Angel, this is filler. There's still not really that great of a life burst option at level 1, and I needed to fill out the life burst. So this is something that you can upgrade if you want. Whenever the Signy attacks, target red Signy on your field gets plus 2000 power till the turn. It's come up sometimes that will stop some life burst against black decks that have negative attacks, or things that, for example, vanish something, 6,000 or less or whatever, and this might get over that threshold. And sometimes it'll also help break walls, but just by giving that extra 2,000 power to a 10,000 attacker, which 12,000 is enough to finish something off. Realistically, you're using it just because it's got an okay life burst that draws you a card and enter charges 1. As soon as, if you could, for example, get a 5th copy and 6th copy of Sita, you'd rather run something like that over this Eris. So this would be one of the ones that you're like, oh, this is a filler and I can cut it. Moving along into our level 2s, we're going to have quite a few. We've got Lancelot, and you're only running 3, and it's one of the most powerful cards in this, so I wouldn't fault you for running 4, by the way. But you're running 3 just because we're also, since we're mono red, we're also running Hera. Hera and Lancelot are basically the same thing. Hera is slightly better because its ability is to remove something and it's reusable, with the downside of everything on your field has to be red, which is not a downside in a mono red deck, it's just pure upgrade at that point. And it does it on attack phase, which means that it's enter depriving your opponent past the point that they can interact with a attack phase trigger like growing and Sistel Rig, which most defenses come into. So Hera is more powerful in this case. We use Lancelot as just sort of like Hera 6, 7, and 8, whatever. So you could probably figure out a way to put this up to 4 and still feel pretty comfortable with it. I prefer having 6 or 7 of that effect. The last time I ran 8, it just felt like it was a little bit too much on that front. We'll skip Mars for a second here. And the last level 2 here we have is Volcanic Natural Crystal. Again, this is one of the ones that we probably can upgrade in the future, but I run it strictly because it's a 10,000, which sometimes helps you wall against some Signy, sometimes helps you break through some spots that you otherwise had trouble with. Remember that with your center, this is attacking for 12,000 with your Elrig. So this can usually get through some of those bigger walls that your opponent are putting out as a level 2 and level 3s to block you out of the game. But it's really there for that life burst. Again, you'll see it again, vanish target Signy on your opponent's field with 8,000 or less. It's free. The life burst kills all the early game stuff, opens up an early game path for you to really just keep plugging in damage. So it's good. It's replaceable as we'll go forward with the meta, but for now it's something that I think is probably fairly great to have in your deck. And that's all the level 2s that you'll see. Again, you'll see that I have more level 1s and level 2s and less level 3s than normal deck distribution does, and that just goes to show you that, again, No Limit is an aggro deck at heart, and so it really wants to just keep pushing in damage, and as such, you want to have a more reliable, good early game. That's why, for example, you could cut this and put it as level 3s for a better quote-unquote distribution of a Wixoss deck, but I would rather just always ensure I have attackers ready to go. The level 3s are as follows. We've got Rose Quartz, which is going to be the No Limit primary reason. One of the reasons you play No Limit aside from the Glory Grow. And that's just because its team enter ability is just basically vanish any Signy on your opponent's side of the field. I know it's 12,000 or less, and there's some things like Chandelier, for example, that are 3,000, 13,000 or more. But realistically, this is going to get rid of every problem Signy in your way that everything else is not otherwise doing. It has an auto ability which lets you attack, and then you can discard cards and you can draw 2 cards. I probably would always go ahead and use that. This deck does suffer a little bit from the fact that it has some Nova Yogas. Nova. Oh, I can't pronounce it. Give me a second. As soon as I see it, I will pronounce it correctly. This girl. And she has an issue where if she doesn't rise on top of something, she could be dead weight in your hand, especially if you have Burning Infernos in hand. Sometimes I've seen some no limits decks, you can play 3 of these and 4 Burning Infernos, which 7 cards that could be late game dead in your hand is difficult. So I would go ahead and say that it's pretty necessary to have Rose Quartz's ability to basically cycle away cards that aren't good to find cards that are good. Most of the time you're going to be looking for guards late in the game when you're attacking with this anyways. So it's just, again, one of your primary reasons to go into level 3s. In fact, so much so that I ended up with Tobiel. I was not a Tobiel believer at the beginning of 0-1 meta, and towards the end of 0-1 meta, I just kept finding reasons to stick more in there. I don't think you need to go to the full 4 like some people do, but this does let you, again, break through some walls, but more importantly, it lets you cycle out those cards that are not so great, right? You can play, like if you have a huge hand, you could play this, find the cards that are the correct removal that you need for lane clearing, sacrifice this once per turn, and then put out the lane clearing stuff that you need to do, like Rose Quartz. And again, you'll see that it doesn't have the greatest life burst, but it still says basically open up a lane for your life burst, and that's good enough. You want to open up lanes. It misses more often than I'd like, being a target up Signy, but hey, sometimes you gotta do the target up. At least you can draw a card if it misses. And then the last one is Nova Yoga, and this one is interesting. I don't think you should view this as a level 3 Signy. It is definitely something that can attack and can win the game. The double crush is not something that I think happens all that often, but when it does happen, it feels amazing to pull off. This is a spell, realistically. This basically reads, as long as you control a Signy, vanish target Signy on your opponent's field with 8,000 or less. More or less, that's what this card does. So it's almost like a just slightly worse version of Burning Inferno. And if you view it on that lens, you will always play this deck more correctly, because you should enter that card and you should discard it to draw other cards as often as you would do a spell, because otherwise you will end up in a scenario where you have too many of these in hand and they're not doing anything for you. So it's a late game threat on its own. It's a spell that can become a late game threat. But you should recognize that it is worth less than an early game Signy, at least in the early game. And then when we move on, we talk about Deafening Inferno. It's just still one of the best removal spells that you could possibly run, especially in No Limit, where you're basically hitting 10,000 or less. That is almost everything, including level 3s. And then it has Vanish Target up to Signy on its text. Again, that life burst is not as good, especially because if it misses, you don't do anything. You don't even get to draw a card with it. But the text itself from the spell itself is so good that you definitely want to just run all 4 copies. You're going to be in scenarios where turn 1, you're going to want to decide whether or not you want to Akino Rock something, or whether you're going to want to Deafening Inferno something. I lean towards Akino Rocking, just so that way I can then Akino Bye-Bye later in the game and not run into a scenario where I'm stranded waiting to Akino Rock and then bye-bye for value. But then you should use Deafening Inferno. Probably mid-game is the right call, and Akino Rock early game, and you won't go wrong with that. Let's talk about the last card, which is going to be Mars. So you could use Mars if you want, by the way, just for this assassin ability. It's a little awkward to pull off. But its main thing is to go under various walls when you start getting walled out later in the game, and you can go to the top, so that way you can get that single copy of Mars. But that's, I found, been a little bit cute, and what I think is better is running a single copy of Phoenix Natural Planet Queen. And hey, look, I talked about one changing Diva card out of the entire set that you could run in it. I think it's fine. I think it's a little awkward because you have to Harmony one white Elrig, which if you want to use your center Elrig's, let's see where it is. Your center Elrig's ability, you have to down 2 level 2 Elrigs on your field. So this is like, you want to be doing it, playing it turn 3 or turn 5 and not so much turn 4. But there has been scenarios where this, because it's an on-attack trigger, and it doesn't need to attack, it'll get rid of some amount of enter, and you can enter screw your opponent, right? Like if your opponent is an Uchu deck, they are waiting to bang to Capo, they have 1 green enter ready to go to stop you from being able to double crush their life cloth, and then you play this, you ruin their deck. It doesn't take much to do that. Now, however, you are running the risk of running into Xenocluster by doing this. So that's why it's a less of copy. It's just less important, right? The second ability that says that if you have enter burned 2 or more this turn, then you get to draw a card. That never happens unless you also play Go to the Top. But it's just a little bit of diversity that this deck might use. Plus, there's not a ton extra. That's just a random level 3 with no life burst. So it's just my choice of just a level 3 no life burst flex card that you can use, but realistically, you could potentially use anything you need for that. Let's talk about some other options that you can have, right? Because it would just be dumb to talk about this mono red deck and then call it a day. Inevitably, you've got some other options here, and this is me looking through all the options and just making sure I didn't miss anything. We should talk about Xenocluster. You could replace Go to the Top with Xenocluster if you want. This would shore your matchup against things like Madoka, Uchu, and maybe other no-limit decks. If you'd like to do that kind of thing, I personally would still use the Go to the Top, just because I think it's just redundancy to what this aggro deck wants to do. And I think when you start getting too fancy with aggro decks, you end up diluting what they do and make them a bad mid-range deck. So, but it is an option to run. It's definitely something, if you have a slower meta that does a lot of discard, then I would consider running it. Let's talk about Ray Flashblade, as well as, yeah, that's it, just Ray Flashblade. Let's say you're too scared, there's so much Xenocluster in your meta, you don't want to go to the top anymore, you're so scared about this discard effects, you can just run Ray Flashblade instead of Ray Winterblade. It doesn't make your opponent discard cards, you draw 2 extra cards, which is going to be important for a Signy I talk about in just a bit, but you could run this instead and lower the amount that Xenocluster can actually really do. Now, you shouldn't be afraid of Xenocluster, I don't think, as no limit, just because, okay, so if you make them discard a card at 1 turn and then they have to discard 2 cards later and they Xenocluster to draw 3, well, they're at a net of 0 and they used a piece to just stay at pace with you. So it is not, specifically no limit is not necessarily destroyed by Xenocluster like some of these other decks are. But if, for example, you're like, you know what, I just don't even want to risk it, you can run Xenocluster yourself and also run Ray Flashblade and minimize how much Xenocluster can really do. Another single copy that you can run is Zephyr, Crimson Evil. It's just another way to get some amount of like reach, right? You just put another red Signy into your field into the trash, maybe something you don't need anymore, and then you can just vanish something on your field with 3,000 else. I don't love it. 3,000 or less, plus I need to trash my own Signy, I'd rather use Enter, is not an amazing cost. But you know what? If you are running into a shit ton of no limit in your meta, or things that are 3,000 or less, there's a lot of good utility level 1 Signys that do that. You might run this as a basically number 5 and number 6 version of Ramel, and it will get you pretty far. Another one is Hasi Phantom Aquatic Beast. Now, I actually really like this one. but it's awkward because it's blue. It's an aggressive blue card. Generally speaking, when you're attacking with this early in the game, you will always have more than 4 cards in hand. Between, for example, if you were to decide to go with Ray Flashblade, you'll pretty much always be at 6 cards in hand until it starts getting to late game, in which case, once it gets to late game, this isn't really going to matter all that much. What really is important for it is that it has a life burst, which says if you have 4 or more cards in your hand, then Vanish Target up Signy on your opponent's field. Now, again, I hate up Signy. It's the worst card. It's the worst text to hit across, but it's better, in my opinion, than, for example, draw a card and enter charge 1 as a life burst. Yes, there are scenarios where this card will fail, but those scenarios should happen later in the game when it doesn't really matter whether or not it fails, because this wasn't winning you the game anyways if you hit that life burst. So it's an option to basically replace one of those cards. And I think it's pretty good. And then the last 2 I have are a little bit of weird. I have Nuncha High-Armed. She's riding a nunchuck, which is cool on its own. But theoretically, right, this put target card from your opponent's enter into their trash draw card is bad Wixoss text as a life burst pretty much everywhere but aggro. If you can limit how much you can blow them out, by the way, by doing this, and then they're like, oh, I don't have the right amount of enter to do an assist grow anymore. This is gonna screw me. This could get you some amount of basically extending that early game, right? Instead of what most aggro decks do is they go for reach, right? Things that will, like Assassin's a good example of reach, or Lancer is a good example of reach. Things that will inevitably do damage in a roundabout way, so that way you can win a late game. This kind of quote-unquote extends that early game by strangling your opponent's resources to stretch it, to make it harder for them to get to their late game win cons, their late game stabilizers, and will let you potentially win a game that way. I don't love this card, but it's worth mentioning as an option, especially in this new set that's coming out. And the last one is He Natural Element. So this is strange, but I've actually seen a fair amount of American winning decks with He Natural Element as a choice that they use. And the reason being is pretty much against every other deck except for, this is important, except for Card Jockey. He Natural Element is a very good wall. So if you're looking at being in a racing meta, just having 1 or 2 tech cards that you can use to more or less slow the opponent down might be the difference between you winning and you losing. Now again, I said this before and I'll say it again, I don't think going too fancy with your aggro decks is a recipe for success, because I think it makes you a bad mid-range deck. But if you dip into it just slightly, you might be able to pull out a good result. So it's worth mentioning that this is something you could dip into. It also doesn't have any life burst, which is you kind of need more cards without life burst to fill out the rest of your deck. So that is something to consider. Overall, this is what I would suggest to use as the Hirana no limit deck. That's our upgrade for changing Diva. If you guys want to see more upgrades to future decks, as well as the new decks that are coming out with changing Diva, just go ahead and give me a subscribe. Me and Tiffany will keep you up to loop with all of the metagame changes that are happening in Wixoss. And as always, may you flip a life burst.